Armed conflict has multiple long and short-term impacts on development and on environmental and human well-being. The effects, even of internal conflicts, are felt at various levels within the immediate area of conflict and often in neighboring countries. Conflict destroys environmental, physical, human, and social capital, diminishing available opportunities for sustainable development. Its impact on human well-being, reducing quality of life, the capabilities of people to live the kind of lives they value, and the real choices they have.
It is so decided.
The Sustainable Development Goals, which replaced the Millennium Development Goals to much fanfare in 2015, are intended as a blueprint for development for the next 15 years and seek to integrate the environmental, social, and economic dimensions of sustainable development.
If we're going to hit the Sustainable Development Goals, we really need to tackle these environmental impacts, because when you damage the environment in conflict, it sets you back years on the path to sustainable development. So for many countries, they're going to really struggle to hit the 2030 targets unless we do more to protect the environment throughout the conflict cycle.
I think that if you look at the MDGs, you look at how we used to conceive of sustainable development, it was a three-legged stool: environmental, social, and economic, right? The SDGs have a fourth leg: peace. You cannot have sustainable development if you do not have peace. And this is revolutionary for the UN. Sustainable development means consideration of peace. And consideration of peace means sustainable development. So we are finally making that link. It's hard.
Back in 1992, concern over the environmental damage wrought by the 1991 Gulf War had fueled international concern over the environmental legacy of conflict in a way not seen since the Vietnam War. During the Second United Nations Environment Assembly in June 2016, a resolution from Ukraine on the protection of the environment in areas affected by armed conflict was approved by consensus. The resolution is the most significant United Nations resolution of its kind since 1992. This new resolution reflects not only a deeper understanding of the environmental implications of armed conflict throughout the conflict cycle, but also growing international interest in finally tackling the weak state of legal protection for the environment and the inadequate systems of environmental response and recovery.
Member states are recognizing that it's important to protect the environment during times of armed conflict, and recognizing the role that UNEP can play in assessing the environmental impacts of conflict after the conflict is finished, and helping countries recover in that post-conflict period.
The resolution stresses the need to protect the environment in conflict and for its restoration following conflicts. It also emphasizes the need to raise awareness of wartime environmental damage, to challenge the notion of the environment as a silent victim of conflict. States are also urged to cooperate closely on minimizing and mitigating environmental harm.
We have to think about displacement, whether from conflict or natural disasters, both in terms of time. Is it temporary or permanent? Is it forced or voluntary? Is it within the country or is it across borders? For each of these scenarios and situations, people will have different choices and legal frameworks and financial mechanisms that can support them. Oftentimes, there are very limited support mechanisms. We need to have a better understanding, really, of what it is that makes people move and how we can better help them adapt to the increasing risk, whether that is social risk or environmental risk. And also member states really need to come up with their own support mechanisms to help their people really cope.
The United Nations Environment Assembly's resolution on conflict and the environment serves a number of purposes. The breadth of legal frameworks it covers reflects the prevailing discourse on strengthening and protection of the environment in relation to armed conflict reasonably well. The inclusion of key themes such as gender and displacement not only frames wartime environmental damage as a humanitarian issue, but will also serve to encourage greater consideration of how these dimensions should be integrated into policymaking and programs. The focus on compliance and implementation serves as a reminder that not only is the existing law protecting the environment weak, but it is often poorly implemented and suffers from a lack of case law and precedent. Environment experts say the United Nations Environment Programme should be encouraged by the consensus reached on the resolution, as it helps reinforce a mandate that, by its nature, can be politically problematic for what is a relatively small and arm's-length United Nations body.
At least 1.5 billion people around the world live in conflict-affected and fragile states, 20% of all the people on the planet. And if there is environmental damage during conflict, that's a problem for the environment, but it's a problem for reconstruction, getting back onto a development track and helping people recover after crisis. Now, UNEP plays two particular roles in this area. One is that we are very often asked by member states to go in after a crisis and assess the damage and assess what has happened, what are the environmental priorities in that post-conflict reconstruction period, and how should they be addressed. And so we go in as a neutral, impartial set of experts with scientific expertise in understanding what has actually happened and what should the priorities be afterwards. And that then feeds into the priorities of, we hope, the UN, the country itself, the international community, and saying, these are the main things that you need to address, whether it's toxic waste, whether it's pollution, whether it's deforestation, and so on. So that's one thing we do. And the second thing that I think we play a really important role in is helping countries recover after conflict and crisis. Helping countries put back in place environmental management systems, helping to reinstate approaches to manage natural resources. The environmental damage is direct, but it's also indirect in terms of government systems breaking down, people being unable to manage natural resources. So that creates legacies. And so UNEP walks with countries in a process of recovery after crisis.
But the single most important thing, and certainly an observation from the preparatory negotiations and the second United Nations Environment Programme itself, is that it has provided and will continue to provide what analysts described as a vehicle for states, international organizations, and civil society to discuss, debate, and engage in conflict and the environment. It has been argued that the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals will require a step change in how the international community deals with the environmental dimensions of armed conflict. This resolution is the start of a long overdue conversation